"Pack your things. You're suspended," the principal said, her voice echoing across the office while teachers watched the orphan girl like she'd just committed a crime against the entire school. They said she hacked the academy's security network and endangered the reputation of the most prestigious school in Washington. But the girl didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't beg. She only waited quietly beside the desk because within minutes a call would reach that office from the Pentagon, and everyone in the room would realize they had just suspended the wrong student. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. This wasn't really about school discipline. It was about power, misjudging quiet brilliance. Before I show you the exact moment the Pentagon demanded to speak with the suspended student by name, you need to see how it started. She stood there, a thin backpack hanging from one shoulder, eyes steady despite the whispers circling the office. Mara Cade had learned long ago that shouting never helped when powerful people had already decided who you were. So she simply watched the principal slide the suspension form across the desk. Dr. Helena Voss didn't look angry. She looked certain. Certain the scholarship orphan had finally proven she didn't belong among diplomats' children and tech billionaires' heirs. The office smelled of polished wood and expensive perfume, symbols of a world that rarely noticed students who arrived by city bus. The girl noticed everything, though. The blinking network monitor in the corner, the muted security alert no one else seemed to understand. Because the signal moving through the school system wasn't random. It was structured, deliberate, dangerous. She had seen code like that before in rooms far away from classrooms. But explaining that now wouldn't change the way the principal looked at her. To them she was just the quiet orphan with the old laptop. And suspending her solved the problem neatly. Across the hall lockers slammed and distant laughter drifted through the doorway. Life at Jefferson Crest Academy was already moving on. But the girl knew something they didn't. The breach in the system was still there. And if nobody stopped it soon, the people calling from Washington wouldn't be asking politely. She adjusted the strap of her backpack and turned toward the door. Behind her, the principal was already telling the secretary to file the suspension immediately. But somewhere miles away, inside a quiet Pentagon monitoring room, a different alarm had just begun. The analysts staring at scrolling code didn't know a school hallway was connected to the attack they were tracking. They only saw an unknown interruption slicing through the hostile program like a precise blade, and the signature inside that interruption belonged to someone trained in methods almost nobody outside their division knew. Back at the academy, the suspended student stepped into the corridor where fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Students passed without noticing the envelope in her hand. Suspension papers always looked ordinary. Just ink and signatures deciding where someone did or didn't belong. She paused beside a computer terminal near the robotics lab. Leo Mercer was inside packing delicate wires into a small metal frame. The younger boy glanced up, his eyes worried. He already knew something bad had happened. Rumors moved faster than announcements in a school like this. The girl set the envelope down beside the keyboard. For a moment her fingers hovered above the keys. The network map flashed across the monitor, lines of movement racing silently through servers the administrators believed were safe. There it was again. The same creeping signal hiding behind ordinary traffic. She exhaled slowly. Stopping it completely would take access she no longer had. But slowing it down again. That she could still manage. Across campus, the principal was probably celebrating decisive leadership. The thought almost made her smile. Almost. Because none of them realized the problem they blamed on her hadn't ended when they took her access away. It had only started. Somewhere beyond the school walls, Powerful people were already following the digital trail she accidentally exposed. And when they finished tracing it, the first place they would call was the network where the interruption happened. Which meant very soon the phone inside the principal's office would ring. When it did, the quiet suspension of one orphan student was going to become something much harder to ignore. She lifted the envelope again. Leo watched silently from the doorway. "It's okay," he started to say, but she shook her head gently. This wasn't over yet. And somewhere in Washington, a red alert was beginning to flash across a military screen tied to the same school network. Within minutes, someone there would ask a single question: who interrupted the attack? The answer was already waiting. The robotics lab door creaked softly as the suspended student stepped back into the hallway, the suspension envelope still folded in her hand. Fluorescent lights hummed above, reflecting faintly on the polished floor as students drifted past without noticing anything unusual. To them, this was just another ordinary afternoon at Jefferson Crest Academy. To her, the network map still glowing in her mind said otherwise. Behind the glass wall of the lab, Leo Mercer lingered near the doorway, clutching a small controller for his half-finished robot. The younger boy watched her carefully, like someone trying to understand a storm before it arrived. "You didn't really hack the school, did you?" he asked quietly. The question carried more worry than accusation. She paused beside the lockers, adjusting the worn strap of her backpack. For a moment she considered brushing it off the way most people expected, shrugging and walking away. Instead, she crouched slightly so she was closer to his height. "I fixed something that was already broken," she said calmly. Leo frowned. But the principal said, "I know what she said." Her voice stayed steady, not bitter, not angry, just certain. The hallway speakers crackled faintly as an afternoon announcement echoed through the building. Students continued moving between classrooms, laughing, complaining about homework, unaware of the quiet tension threading through the network cables above their heads. Inside the main administrative office, Dr. Helena Voss stood near the tall windows overlooking the school courtyard. The suspension document was already signed and stamped on her desk. A decisive action. A necessary message. Elite institutions survived on reputation, and she had spent years protecting Jefferson Crest Academy from scandals that could damage its standing among Washington's most powerful families. Allowing a scholarship student to breach the school's systems would send the wrong signal. The principal folded her hands behind her back, watching expensive cars glide through the circular driveway outside. Parents trusted this school to maintain order. Today she had done exactly that. Across the room, the secretary typed quietly, filing reports and answering routine calls. The office smelled faintly of coffee and polished mahogany. Order had been restored. At least, that was what the principal believed. Down the hallway, the suspended student reached the end of the lockers and turned toward the stairwell leading to the front entrance. Each step echoed softly in the quiet corridor. She could still feel the network structure in her head the way a musician remembers notes after hearing a melody once. The hostile signal had been subtle, layered beneath ordinary system traffic. Someone very skilled had hidden it there. When she slowed it down earlier using the robotics lab terminal, she hadn't just interrupted a school prank. The pattern was wrong for that. Too organized. Too patient. She pushed open the stairwell door. Cool air drifted upward from the lobby below. Leo hurried after her, his sneakers squeaking against the floor. "So, what happens now?" he asked. She thought about the blinking signal moving silently through the school's network infrastructure. Thought about the way it had reacted when she disrupted it, like something alive suddenly realizing it had been noticed. "I guess we find out who notices next," she said. The younger boy didn't fully understand, but he nodded anyway. Sometimes the quiet people were the ones who noticed danger first. Back inside the principal's office, the secretary's phone rang. She picked it up without looking at the caller ID. Jefferson Crest Academy, Administrative Office. A brief pause followed. Then her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Yes, Dr. Voss is here," she said cautiously. Another pause. Her expression changed again, confusion mixing with something closer to concern. "I'm sorry, did you say the Pentagon?" The principal turned slowly from the window. "What is it?" she asked. The secretary lowered the phone slightly. "There's a Colonel Adrian Vale on the line," she said carefully. "He says it's regarding a cybersecurity incident connected to our school network." The principal frowned. That didn't make sense. "Our systems are secure," she replied firmly. "Yes, ma'am, I told him that." The secretary hesitated before raising the receiver again. "He says the matter is urgent." Dr. Helena Voss walked across the office and took the phone. "This is Principal Voss," she said, her voice calm and controlled. "How can I help you?" A deep, steady voice answered from the other end. "Good afternoon, Dr. Voss. This is Colonel Adrian Vale, Pentagon Cyber Defense Division." The principal glanced briefly toward the secretary, who was now watching with open curiosity. "I'm calling regarding a network disruption originating from your academy approximately 40 minutes ago." Her posture stiffened slightly. "Yes, we handled that," she replied. "A student violated school security policies. She's been suspended." There was a brief silence on the line. Then, the colonel spoke again. "Dr. Voss, the individual who interrupted that signal may have just prevented a national security breach." The principal blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "Before we continue," Vale said evenly, "I need you to locate a student named Mara Cade immediately." At that exact moment, the suspended girl stepped through the front doors of Jefferson Crest Academy. The late afternoon sun spilled across the marble lobby floor. Behind her, the school continued its ordinary routine. But inside the principal's office upstairs, the meaning of that routine was about to change. Before we continue the story, make sure you subscribe with the bell on so you don't miss the next unbelievable moment. Because the next 5 minutes inside that office, we're going to turn a suspension into something no one there would ever forget. The late afternoon sunlight poured through the tall glass doors as the suspended girl stepped into the marble lobby of Jefferson Crest Academy. The building behind her buzzed with quiet confidence, students laughing, teachers talking, administrators certain that order had already been restored. Upstairs, that certainty had just begun to crack. Dr. Helena Voss stood motionless beside her desk, the phone pressed to her ear as Colonel Adrian Vale's words settled heavily in the room. "A national security breach?" she repeated slowly. Her voice carried a trace of disbelief she couldn't quite hide. "Yes, ma'am," the colonel replied calmly. "Our division has been tracking a sophisticated intrusion targeting federal defense infrastructure. Approximately 40 minutes ago, that intrusion was unexpectedly interrupted through a network pathway tied to your school." The principal glanced toward the secretary and the visiting board representative sitting near the window. Both were now watching the conversation with growing interest. "That's impossible," she said firmly. "Our systems are isolated from anything federal. They shouldn't intersect," Vale agreed. And yet, they did. The office grew quiet. Outside the window, the academy's manicured courtyard looked as peaceful as ever, students crossing brick paths, leaves rustling in the autumn breeze. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. Dr. Voss tightened her grip on the receiver. "Well," she said carefully, "as I explained, The responsible student has already been disciplined. Another pause followed. When Colonel Vale spoke again, his voice carried the calm patience of someone used to explaining serious matters to people who didn't yet understand the scale. Dr. Voss, the disruption we observed wasn't random interference. The principal felt something in her chest stiffen. It was a precision countermeasure. She blinked. What does that mean? It means, Vale continued evenly, the person who interrupted the intrusion knew exactly what they were looking at. Across the room, the secretary stopped typing entirely. The board representative leaned forward slightly. Dr. Voss stared at the polished surface of her desk, the suspension form still lying there where she had signed it earlier. That's not possible, she said quietly. Our analysts disagree, the colonel replied. Downstairs, the suspended student paused near the school's front gate. The campus lawn stretched wide and immaculate, trimmed hedges framing stone walkways where luxury cars waited for afternoon pickup. She adjusted her backpack strap and stepped onto the sidewalk beyond the academy's iron gates. City traffic murmured in the distance. Normally, she would head toward the bus stop 2 blocks away. Instead, she paused. Something about the network pattern earlier still bothered her. The hostile signal hadn't just reacted when she slowed it down. It had adapted. That meant whoever launched it was monitoring the system in real time, which meant they would have noticed the interruption. She exhaled slowly. If the attackers traced the disruption back to the academy, someone powerful would eventually start asking questions. The thought didn't frighten her. If anything, it made the situation simpler, because the truth about the network breach wasn't something the principal could ignore forever. Back inside the office, Dr. Voss rubbed her temple. Colonel, she said carefully, the student involved is not a cybersecurity specialist. She's a 17-year-old scholarship student. That may be, Vale said, but the code signature used to interrupt the attack matches a defensive protocol developed by our division. The principal frowned. I don't understand, it's not publicly available, the colonel continued. In fact, only individuals trained under a specific program would recognize it. The board representative shifted in his chair. What program? He asked quietly. Dr. Voss covered the receiver for a moment. He's saying the disruption resembles Pentagon cyber defense training, she whispered. The room fell still. That idea sounded absurd. Jefferson Crest Academy educated future diplomats and CEOs, not covert cybersecurity operatives. She lifted the receiver again. Colonel, are you certain about this? Yes, ma'am. And you believe this student? Mara Cade, Vale interrupted gently. The principal froze. He had said the name without hesitation. Yes, she said slowly. That's the student. Another pause settled across the line. When the colonel spoke again, his tone carried a subtle shift, less investigative now, more certain. That confirms it. Dr. Voss felt a strange unease ripple through her. Confirms what? That the interruption wasn't accidental. Outside the academy gates, the girl started walking toward the bus stop. The suspension envelope rustled softly in her hand as wind swept down the street. Behind her, the massive school building looked as calm and untouchable as it always had. But upstairs, inside the principal's office, the colonel's next words began unraveling the story everyone thought they understood. Dr. Voss, he said evenly, Mara Cady participated in a classified youth cyber defense initiative 5 years ago. The principal's fingers tightened around the phone. What initiative? A Pentagon program identifying exceptional analytical talent in foster and orphan systems, Vale explained. The room went silent. Across the desk, the secretary's eyes widened. The board representative slowly sat back, and for the first time since signing the suspension form, the principal felt doubt creep into her certainty. But she's just a student, Dr. Voss whispered. Yes, the colonel replied calmly, and apparently the only person who recognized the attack pattern fast enough to stop it. At that moment, the secretary's computer chimed. A new alert appeared on the screen connected to the school network. The hostile signal was still active, and now it was moving faster. Dr. Voss stared at the notification. "Colonel," she said slowly, "what happens if that signal finishes what it started?" The answer came without hesitation. "Then the breach continues," Vale replied. "And the only person who's already proven she can interrupt it," he paused briefly, "is currently walking out of your school." For a moment, Dr. Helena Voss didn't move. She stood beside her desk, phone pressed against her ear, staring at the blinking alert on the secretary's monitor. The hostile signal pulsed across the network map in thin red lines that crept slowly from node to node. Earlier, she had believed the problem ended the moment the student was suspended. Now it looked like the opposite was true. "Colonel Vale," she said carefully, "you're telling me the intrusion is still active?" "Yes, ma'am." His tone remained calm, but the quiet urgency behind it was impossible to miss. "Our analysts are observing increased movement across the network pathway that originated through your academy." The principal's stomach tightened. Across the desk, the secretary turned the monitor slightly so Dr. Voss could see the alert more clearly. Small warning indicators flickered beside the system map. She didn't understand the technical details, but she understood alarms. "Can your division stop it?" the principal asked. There was a short pause. "We're working on containment," Vale replied, but the individual who disrupted it earlier recognized the entry point before our analysts did. The meaning settled slowly into the room. The board representative leaned forward. "You're saying the student noticed the attack before the Pentagon?" he asked. "Not exactly," Vale said. "We were already tracking it. But she interrupted it faster than expected." Dr. Voss lowered the phone slightly and looked at the blinking network display again. Somewhere inside that system, the orphan she had just suspended had seen something trained analysts had missed. The thought didn't sit comfortably. Down the street outside the academy gates, the girl walked along the sidewalk toward the bus stop. The suspension envelope remained tucked between two fingers, folded neatly as though it were just another assignment paper. Traffic rolled past in steady lines. A city bus groaned as it slowed near the intersection ahead. The wind carried distant horns and the low rumble of engines. She stopped beneath a streetlight and glanced back toward the academy building. From the outside it looked calm and perfect. White stone walls, tall windows, flags shifting gently in the breeze. No one watching it would guess a cyber attack was moving quietly through the cables buried beneath those walls. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket. The device was old, the screen slightly scratched. She pulled it out and glanced at the notification. A network trace she had left running earlier was still active, and the hostile signal had grown stronger. "Of course it did," she murmured quietly. When she slowed the intrusion earlier, she had only delayed it. Whoever launched the attack had already adjusted their approach. The code structure was evolving, which meant the people behind it were experienced. Inside the academy, the principal's voice sharpened. "Secretary Carter," Dr. Voss said, covering the phone for a moment. "Where is the student now?" The secretary hesitated. "She left the building about 2 minutes ago." The board representative stood up. "Shouldn't someone stop her?" he asked. Dr. Voss lifted the receiver again. "Colonel Vale, how important is it that we locate this student immediately?" "Very," Vale answered without hesitation. "Because the intrusion pattern is accelerating. And based on the earlier countermeasure," he paused briefly, "she may already understand how to stop it." The principal glanced toward the window overlooking the academy's front gates. Students crossed the courtyard in clusters. Teachers carried folders toward their cars. Everything looked ordinary. But somewhere beyond those gates, the quiet student everyone had underestimated was walking away. Dr. Voss felt an unfamiliar weight settle behind her ribs. For years she had trusted her instincts when evaluating students. She had built a reputation for recognizing talent and protecting the academy's standards. Now a military officer was calmly explaining that the one student she dismissed might be the only person who could stop something far bigger than a school network problem. The thought unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Outside on the sidewalk, the girl slipped her phone back into her pocket and continued walking. The bus was pulling closer now. But the trace signal in her head kept replaying the network map. The intrusion's entry point wasn't random. It had used a quiet maintenance channel connected to the robotics lab servers. That explained why the attack slipped through unnoticed. The Academy's security systems weren't designed to detect that kind of access. She reached the bus stop and leaned lightly against the metal pole. Cars rolled past in steady streams. Behind her, the academy gates stood open, and through those gates the principal's assistant suddenly came running across the courtyard. The woman looked frantic. She stopped near the front entrance, scanning the street until her eyes landed on the suspended student standing at the bus stop. "Wait," she shouted. The girl turned slightly. The assistant jogged toward the sidewalk, breath uneven. "Principal Voss needs you to come back," she said. The girl studied her quietly. "Did something break?" she asked. The assistant blinked. "How did you?" She stopped mid-sentence, because in the distance sirens had begun to echo across the city. And back inside the academy office, Colonel Adrian Vale was watching the intrusion pattern spike sharply on a Pentagon monitor. "Mara Cade needs to return to the network immediately," he told the principal, "because the attack just entered its second phase." The assistant was still catching her breath when the suspended girl tilted her head slightly. "Did something break?" she asked again. For a second, the woman didn't know how to answer. Students passing on the sidewalk slowed down, curious about why the academy's normally composed administrative assistant had run all the way to the bus stop. "Principal Voss needs you back inside," she finally said. The girl studied her expression carefully. Not angry, not annoyed, worried. That was new. "About the network?" she asked. The assistant blinked. "You already know?" The girl didn't answer directly. Instead, she looked back toward the academy building where tall windows reflected the fading sunlight. Somewhere inside those walls, the network lines were still carrying that hostile signal. And if the Pentagon had already noticed it, things were escalating faster than she expected. She picked up her backpack from the sidewalk and stepped toward the gate. "Okay," she said quietly. Behind them, the bus arrived with a hiss of brakes. But she didn't board it. Inside the academy, the atmosphere in the principal's office had shifted from quiet authority to tense uncertainty. Dr. Helena Voss stood beside the desk, the phone still pressed against her ear as Colonel Adrian Vale's voice continued calmly from the Pentagon. "Our analysts are watching the intrusion expand," he said. The attackers adjusted their approach after the earlier disruption. The principal glanced toward the network display on the secretary's computer. The red lines had multiplied. "What exactly are they trying to access?" she asked. "We believe the intrusion is using a relay structure," Vale replied. "Your school network is acting as an intermediary route." The board representative frowned. "Meaning what?" The colonel answered without hesitation. "Meaning whoever launched the attack used the academy as a stepping stone into a federal communications channel." The room fell silent. Dr. Voss felt a chill crawl through her spine. Jefferson Crest Academy was known for producing diplomats, scientists, and corporate leaders, not accidental entry points into cyber warfare. "You're saying this building is part of the attack route?" she asked. "Correct." And the student recognized the structure before our analysts confirmed it, Vale said. The principal exhaled slowly. Downstairs, the assistant and the suspended girl entered the marble lobby. The secretary at the front desk looked up immediately. "She's here," the assistant called. Upstairs, the principal straightened. "Colonel, she just returned." "Good," Vale replied. "Put her on the line if possible." The girl stepped into the elevator beside the assistant, the metal doors sliding shut with a quiet chime. The ride upward lasted only seconds, but during that brief silence, she could almost hear the network traffic flowing through the academy servers above them. The hostile code had grown bolder. It was probing deeper now, testing defenses. That meant the attackers were confident. Too confident. The elevator doors opened. The assistant guided her quickly down the hallway toward the principal's office. Inside the room, the board representative shifted nervously in his chair while the secretary watched the door. Dr. Voss looked far less certain than she had earlier. The moment the girl stepped inside, every pair of eyes in the office turned toward her. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the colonel's voice came faintly through the speakerphone. "Mara Cade?" She stepped closer to the desk. "Yes, Colonel Adrian Vale." "Pentagon Cyber Defense Division." The girl nodded slightly. "I figured." Dr. Voss blinked. "You figured?" She glanced briefly at the network monitor across the room. "The signal pattern changed after I interrupted it earlier," she explained calmly. "That usually means someone important noticed." The board representative stared at her. The principal looked between the girl and the phone. "Colonel," she said slowly, "are you telling me this student understands the situation better than we do?" "Possibly," Vale replied. The quiet confidence in his voice unsettled the room even further. Across the desk, the secretary turned the monitor again so the girl could see the network map. Red warning indicators pulsed across the screen. The hostile signal was moving through the system like a spreading stain. She leaned closer. Her eyes tracked the pattern for only a few seconds. Then, she exhaled softly. "They're accelerating the second phase," she said. Dr. Voss stiffened. "What does that mean?" "It means they're about to tunnel deeper into the relay path." The principal looked confused. "Into where?" The girl glanced toward the phone, the Pentagon network they're piggybacking off. The board representative nearly stood up. "Wait, you can see that?" "It's obvious if you know the architecture," she replied. The room fell silent again. Even the secretary had stopped typing. On the phone, Colonel Vale spoke again. "Mara, do you believe you can stop the intrusion completely?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched the moving code for another moment. Her fingers tapped lightly against the desk as if tracing invisible lines. Finally, she nodded once. "Yes." Dr. Voss leaned forward. "How?" The girl looked up. "The same way I slowed it down earlier." The principal swallowed. "And that is?" She pointed quietly at the network display. "By attacking the attacker's back." Before the story continues, make sure you subscribe with the bell on so you don't miss what happens next. Because the next thing that quiet student did inside that office was about to turn the Academy's network into a battlefield no one there expected. The office stayed silent for a full second after she said it. By attacking the attacker's back, Dr. Helena Voss blinked slowly, trying to process the calm certainty in the girl's voice. Across the desk, the secretary stared at the monitor as if the screen might suddenly explain everything. On the speakerphone, Colonel Adrian Vale spoke first. "Mara, explain what you're seeing." The girl leaned slightly closer to the display, studying the network map. The red warning signals crawled along the screen in branching lines, connecting systems the Academy staff had never realized were linked. "They're using a relay exploit," she said quietly. The principal frowned. "I don't know what that means." "It means the attack isn't coming directly from the Pentagon's target system," she explained. "They're routing it through smaller networks first." Her finger hovered above the screen. "Like this one." The board representative leaned forward. "You're saying our school is part of the attack chain?" "Not intentionally," she replied. "But yes." The principal felt a cold ripple travel down her spine. Jefferson Crest Academy had always been a place of prestige, polished hallways, academic awards, diplomatic alumni. Now a quiet orphan student was calmly explaining that the Academy's network had become part of a cyber attack on federal systems. "And the earlier interruption?" Colonel Vale asked. "That was Phase 1, she said. The colonel paused. "Meaning?" "I disrupted their timing protocol," she answered. "It slowed the relay long enough to expose the pattern." The secretary stared at her. "You did that from a robotics lab computer." The girl shrugged slightly. "It had access to the maintenance channel." The room grew quiet again. Dr. Voss found herself staring at the student in a completely different way now. Earlier that afternoon, she had seen a disciplinary problem. A scholarship student who broke the rules. Now the same student was reading a cyber attack like a language. "Mara," Colonel Vale said carefully, "our analysts believe the attackers are escalating." "They are," she replied immediately. "How can you tell?" She pointed again at the screen. The data flow changed shape. "See that spike?" The secretary leaned closer. "Oh, I see it." The principal did not. But she could hear the certainty in the girl's voice. "They're moving into the deeper relay now," the student continued. "If they finish the tunnel, they'll bypass the security checkpoints entirely." The board representative's face drained of color. "Bypass them to where?" "Federal Communications Infrastructure," she answered calmly. Dr. Voss inhaled sharply. "So you're telling us the Academy is currently acting like a doorway," she said. The principal felt her earlier confidence crumble piece by piece. She had suspended this girl less than 20 minutes ago. Now that same student was explaining a cyber attack that federal analysts were still studying. "How do we stop it?" Dr. Voss asked quietly. The girl studied the network map again. "First we interrupt the relay path." "How?" "By injecting a counter pattern." The principal blinked. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple," the girl said calmly. "It's just possible." On the phone, Colonel Vale's voice carried something new now, respect. "Mara, if you attempt this, we'll monitor the intrusion from our side." She nodded slightly. "I figured you would." The board representative leaned toward the desk. "Wait a moment," he said nervously. "We're letting a student run a counterattack against cybercriminals targeting federal systems?" The girl looked at him with quiet patience. "They're already inside the relay," she said. "If we don't interrupt the pattern soon, they'll finish the tunnel." Dr. Voss looked between the girl and the glowing network display. The red signals were moving faster now. Even someone with no technical knowledge could see the urgency. The principal exhaled slowly. "What do you need?" The girl turned toward the secretary. "The robotics lab terminal would work best," she said. "Why there?" the secretary asked. "It's the entry point they used earlier," she explained. "And the system still trusts that machine." Colonel Vale spoke again. "That aligns with what our analysts see." Dr. Voss nodded slowly. "Then we'll go there." The decision felt strange even as she said it. Less than half an hour earlier, she had signed papers removing the girl from campus systems. Now she was about to escort that same student back into the network. Because the truth had become impossible to ignore. This quiet orphan knew something none of them did. The group moved quickly down the hallway toward the robotics lab. The secretary carried a laptop connected to the network monitor, while the board representative followed nervously behind. Inside the lab, half-finished machines and tangled wires filled the tables. The girl walked straight to the same terminal she had used earlier. The screen still displayed the slowed intrusion pattern. Except now it was moving faster. Much faster. She sat down and placed her backpack beside the chair. Behind her, Dr. Voss watched silently. The room smelled faintly of soldered metal and machine oil. The girl's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Mara, Colonel Vale said through the speakerphone the secretary carried. "Our analysts are ready to observe." She nodded once. Good. The hostile signal pulsed across the screen like a living thing. The attackers had grown confident again. They believed the earlier disruption was gone. Her fingers settled gently on the keys. "They're about to learn something," she murmured. "What?" the principal asked quietly. The girl glanced back at the screen. That the system they're tunneling through. Her fingers began moving across the keyboard with sudden speed. "Isn't defenseless." The keys clicked in a steady rhythm, sharp and precise against the quiet hum of machines inside the robotics lab. Code began streaming across the monitor faster than anyone else in the room could follow. Behind her, Dr. Helena Voss stood perfectly still. The confident authority she had carried earlier that afternoon had slowly transformed into something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Not fear. But the uneasy realization that the situation unfolding in front of her was far bigger than a school discipline problem. On the desk beside the computer, the secretary's laptop displayed the same network map the Pentagon analysts were watching. Red signals flashed across the pathways. But now new lines, thin, bright blue, were appearing. "What are those?" the secretary asked quietly. The girl didn't stop typing. "Counter channels," she said. The board representative frowned. "You're building new network routes?" "Temporary ones," she replied. Her voice remained calm, almost casual, as if she were adjusting a small setting rather than interfering with a cyber attack targeting federal systems. On the speakerphone, Colonel Adrian Vale spoke. "Mara, our analysts see the counter pattern forming." "Good," she said. The scrolling code intensified across the screen. Numbers, commands, and encrypted strings filled the monitor like flowing water. Dr. Voss stepped slightly closer. "How long will this take?" The girl tilted her head, studying a sequence of code as it appeared. "Depends how stubborn they are. Who?" "The attackers." The principal felt a strange chill in the room, because the way the student said it made it sound like a conversation happening silently across the network. One side pushing, the other responding. Colonel Vale spoke again. "Our sensors show the intrusion slowing." "Only temporarily," the girl replied. Her hands continued moving. "If they realize what I'm doing, they'll reroute." The secretary leaned closer to the monitor. The red lines had indeed slowed. But they hadn't stopped. "They're adapting," she said nervously. The girl nodded slightly. "Of course they are." She typed another command. The blue counter pattern shifted again. From the Pentagon Monitoring Center, analysts watched the same change ripple across their displays. One of them turned toward Colonel Vale. "Sir, the student's rerouting the relay structure itself." The colonel folded his arms. "Meaning, she's turning their own tunnel into a trap." Back in the robotics lab, the board representative looked increasingly uncomfortable. "Trap?" he asked. The girl spoke without looking away from the screen. "The attackers built a pathway through this network." "Yes. So I'm closing the exits." Dr. Voss felt her pulse quicken. "What happens when they realize that?" They'll try to escape. And if they can't? The girl's fingers paused briefly over the keyboard. Then she typed one final command. They'll expose themselves. The network map shifted again. Red signals clustered tightly along the relay path, no longer spreading outward. The secretary gasped softly. They're stuck. Colonel Vale's voice came through the speakerphone again. Mara. That was extremely precise. They're probing the walls now, she replied calmly, trying to break through. Dr. Voss looked from the screen to the quiet student sitting in the chair. Less than an hour ago, she had believed this girl was a rule-breaker who threatened the Academy's reputation. Now, federal cyber defense officers were watching her work and trusting her decisions. The principal swallowed. What happens next? The girl leaned back slightly in the chair, her eyes scanning the network activity. They're going to panic soon, the board representative blinked. Why? Because they just realized the relay path isn't working anymore. The red signals on the monitor suddenly surged. New spikes appeared across the network. They're trying to brute force the exit, the secretary said. The girl nodded. Exactly. Colonel Vale spoke again. Our analysts confirmed the attackers are escalating. Good, she said quietly. Dr. Voss frowned. You want them to escalate? The girl turned slightly toward her. Yes. Why? Because when they push harder, her gaze returned to the screen, they reveal where they're actually coming from. The network map flickered again. This time a new data trail appeared, thin and faint but unmistakable. The secretary leaned forward. Is that the source? Almost, the girl replied. On the Pentagon side of the connection, analysts watched the same trail appear on their screens. One of them turned quickly toward Colonel Vale. Sir, we're getting a trace. The colonel's eyes narrowed. Already? Yes. Back inside the robotics lab, the girl typed another command. The counter pattern tightened further around the attacker's signal. They're running out of options now, she said quietly. Dr. Voss felt the tension building in the room. The air seemed heavier. Even the machines sounded louder. Colonel, the principal said carefully, are you seeing this? Yes, Vale replied, and if the trace completes? Then we identify whoever launched the intrusion. The girl's fingers hovered over the keyboard again. The trace line was growing clearer. The attackers were pushing desperately now, exactly as she expected. Dr. Voss leaned closer. Do you know where it's leading? The girl watched the screen for another moment. Then she nodded slightly. Yes. The principal held her breath. Where? The girl pressed the final key, the trace completed, and the location of the attackers appeared on the screen. For the first time that afternoon, the quiet student allowed herself the faintest smile. Right where I thought. The words settled quietly in the robotics lab as the trace line on the screen stabilized. A new window opened automatically on the monitor displaying the origin point of the attack. Numbers, coordinates, server routes. Behind the girl, no one spoke for several seconds. Dr. Helena Voss leaned closer to the screen, trying to understand what she was seeing. The location marker pulsed faintly in the center of the display. Is that the source? The principal asked. The girl nodded once. Yes. Across the room, the secretary gasped softly. The board representative stood frozen, staring at the glowing coordinates. On the speakerphone, Colonel Adrian Vale spoke again, his voice sharper now. Our analysts confirmed the trace. A second voice murmured faintly behind him on the Pentagon line. Then, Vale continued. Mara, the signal is originating from a private server cluster overseas. The girl wasn't surprised. They built the relay carefully, she said. But they got impatient when the tunnel slowed down. Dr. Voss folded her arms tightly. You forced them to reveal themselves. Yes, the principal studied the quiet student sitting at the keyboard. Earlier that afternoon, she had believed discipline would restore control. Now control had arrived from somewhere she never expected. A scholarship orphan typing calmly in a robotics lab. The secretary turned the laptop screen toward the principal. Look, she said quietly. The red intrusion signals were collapsing inward on the network map, trapped inside the counter pattern the girl had created. They can't escape the tunnel anymore, the secretary said. Correct, the girl replied. The board representative blinked. So, the attack is over? Not yet. She pointed toward the pulsing signal. They're still trying to break the relay. Colonel Vale's voice carried a hint of urgency now. Mara, our cyber teams are preparing a capture protocol based on your trace. That will work, she said calmly. But they'll try one last surge before they lose access. The principal frowned. What kind of surge? The girl's eyes moved across the screen, a destructive one. Dr. Voss felt her stomach tighten. You mean they could damage our network? They could try, the girl said. But if they do, she tapped a few keys, they'll damage their own system first. New lines appeared across the network map, stronger barriers surrounding the relay channel. The secretary leaned closer. What did you just do? I reversed the tunnel pressure. The board representative looked completely lost. I don't understand anything that's happening. The girl gave a small shrug. That's probably safer. On the Pentagon line, analysts spoke rapidly in the background. Colonel Vale returned a moment later. Mara, our teams confirm the attackers are escalating exactly as you predicted. She nodded slightly. They're desperate now. The principal glanced nervously between the student and the screen. The hostile signal suddenly flared bright red across the display. There, the secretary said. They're pushing. The girl leaned forward again, her fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. They're trying to burn through the relay. Dr. Voss watched the screen anxiously. Can they? No. The answer came with quiet certainty. Her hands continued typing. Lines of defensive code strengthened the network walls she had built around the attack. The hostile signal pulsed violently, then slowed, then flickered. Across the Pentagon Monitoring Center, analysts watched the same thing happening in real time. One technician turned toward Colonel Vale. Sir, the relay tunnel is collapsing. Because of her counter pattern? Vale asked. Yes. Back inside the robotics lab, the girl exhaled softly. They're running out of energy. The secretary stared at the screen. The red signal dimmed slightly. They're losing control. The board representative finally let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. So, this is it? Almost, she said. Dr. Voss leaned closer to the desk. What happens when the signal disappears? The girl paused briefly. Then she looked up at the principal. Then the Pentagon finishes the capture. And the attackers, they get identified. At that moment, the hostile signal flared one last time. A surge of red streaked across the screen. The secretary gasped. They're trying again. But the girl didn't panic. Her fingers pressed two final commands. The counter pattern locked into place. The red surge hit the barrier and shattered. Across the network map, the hostile signal collapsed rapidly, its movement breaking apart like glass fragments under pressure. Inside the Pentagon Monitoring Center, alarms began sounding. Technicians shouted confirmations. Trace complete. Source identified. Attack neutralized. Colonel Vale's voice returned to the speakerphone. Mara, for the first time, the composed military officer sounded impressed. That was exceptional. The girl leaned back slightly in the chair. It wasn't over yet. Dr. Voss blinked. What do you mean? The student pointed quietly at the screen. The hostile signal had vanished, but something else had appeared. A long chain of data logs. The trace records. Proof of the entire intrusion. Now, the girl said calmly, you have evidence. The principal stared at the display. Evidence that the Academy's network had been used in a cyber attack against federal infrastructure. Evidence that the quiet orphan she suspended had stopped it. Evidence that the story she believed earlier that afternoon was completely wrong. Before the story continues, make sure you subscribe with the bell on so you don't miss what happens next. Because the next conversation inside that office was going to change the way everyone there looked at that student forever. The robotics lab fell into a strange, quiet stillness after the signal vanished. For several seconds, the only sound was the soft hum of machines and the faint tapping of Pentagon analysts still working on the other end of the call. On the screen, the red warning lights were gone. In their place stretched a long chain of logs, lines of digital evidence tracing the attack from the Academy's network all the way to the overseas servers that launched it. The girl leaned back in the chair and folded her hands quietly in her lap. It's done, she said. Across the desk, Dr. Helena Voss stared at the monitor as if the screen itself had betrayed her. An hour ago, she had believed she was protecting the Academy's reputation. Now, she was standing inside a robotics lab watching the student she suspended dismantle a cyber attack targeting federal infrastructure. Colonel Adrian Vale's voice came through the speakerphone again. Our teams confirm the intrusion has been neutralized. The secretary exhaled with visible relief. So, it's really over? Operationally, yes, Vale replied, but the investigation is just beginning. The board representative shifted nervously. Investigation? Yes, the colonel said. The trace data your student generated will allow federal agencies to pursue the source. Dr. Voss slowly turned toward the girl sitting at the terminal. You did all of this from the robotics lab? The student shrugged slightly. It was the easiest access point. The principal struggled to find words. Moments earlier, she had been the authority figure in control of every decision. Now she felt like the least informed person in the room. How did you even recognize the attack pattern? She asked quietly. The girl glanced at the screen again. I've seen similar relay structures before. The board representative frowned. Where? Before the girl could answer, Colonel Vale spoke again. Dr. Voss, perhaps I should clarify something. The principal straightened slightly. Yes, Colonel? Mara Cade was part of a Pentagon initiative known as the Youth Cyber Defense Program. The room went still again. The secretary blinked. You mean a government program? Yes, Vale replied. Participants were identified through advanced analytical testing within foster care and orphan support systems. The girl didn't look up from the screen. The board representative stared at her in disbelief. So, she's been trained by the Pentagon? Several years ago, Vale confirmed. Dr. Voss felt the weight of that revelation settle heavily in her chest. The quiet orphan she had dismissed as a disciplinary problem had once been selected for a federal defense training program. Suddenly, her earlier certainty about the student's abilities felt painfully naive. Mara, the principal said slowly, why didn't you mention this earlier? The girl looked up calmly. You didn't ask. The simplicity of the answer made the room fall silent again. Because it was true. No one had asked. The Academy had seen a scholarship orphan with an old laptop. They hadn't seen the possibility of something more. Across the desk, the secretary glanced at the suspension envelope still lying beside the keyboard. The official document looked strangely small now. Dr. Voss noticed it too. For the first time since signing it, the principal felt a deep discomfort settle in her thoughts. I suspended you, she said quietly. The girl didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked at the network logs one more time. The hostile signal was completely gone now. The system was calm again. Finally, she spoke. You thought I caused the problem. Dr. Voss nodded slowly. Yes. The girl closed the monitoring window. I understand why. That answer surprised the principal even more than the earlier technical explanations. You understand? You saw someone accessing the system without permission, the girl said. That's usually a bad sign. The board representative shook his head slightly. But you were trying to stop the attack. Yes. Why didn't you explain that during the meeting? The girl picked up the folded suspension envelope from the desk. Because the signal was still moving, she replied. And arguing wouldn't have stopped it. The secretary stared at her. So you just accepted the suspension? She nodded once. It was faster. Dr. Voss felt something shift uncomfortably inside her chest. The student hadn't protested, hadn't argued, hadn't tried to defend herself, because she had been focused on stopping the attack. That quiet decision made the principal's earlier authority feel suddenly very small. On the phone, Colonel Vale spoke again. Dr. Voss. Yes, Colonel? Our division will be sending representatives to collect the network data and speak with the student. The principal nodded automatically. Of course. Then the colonel added one more sentence. And I strongly recommend that when they arrive. He paused briefly. The Academy treats Maracade with the respect her actions today deserve. The room fell silent again. The principal looked at the student standing beside the terminal. The suspension envelope rested lightly in her hand, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Dr. Helena Voss realized something clearly. The power dynamic in the room had completely changed. Because the person she had tried to remove from the academy was the same person who had just protected it. The realization settled heavily over the robotics lab. For a long moment, no one spoke. The girl stood beside the terminal holding the suspension envelope while the quiet hum of machines filled the room. The network screen showed nothing but clean traffic now, calm lines replacing the aggressive red signals that had filled it earlier. Dr. Helena Voss slowly exhaled. The room felt smaller than it had before. Mara, the principal said carefully. The girl looked up. Yes? Dr. Voss glanced briefly at the envelope in her hand. I owe you an apology. The words felt unfamiliar leaving her mouth. Authority figures weren't used to apologizing to students, especially not scholarship students. But the weight of what had just happened made denial impossible. I misjudged the situation, the principal continued. And I misjudged you. The girl didn't immediately respond. She simply watched the principal with the same calm expression she had shown since the beginning. Across the room, the secretary quietly closed the laptop displaying the network map. The board representative rubbed his forehead, still trying to absorb everything he had witnessed. Principal Voss, he said slowly, this entire incident could have ended very differently. The principal nodded, yes. She turned back toward the student. I suspended you without understanding what you were doing. The girl glanced down at the envelope. The paper rustled softly in her hand. Then she placed it on the desk beside the keyboard. You were protecting the school, Dr. Voss continued quietly. And far more than the school. On the speakerphone, Colonel Adrian Vale spoke again. Our analysts have finished confirming the trace logs. Everyone in the room looked toward the phone. The attackers are now identified, the colonel said. The secretary leaned forward. You caught them? Federal investigators will handle the rest, Vale replied. But yes, the intrusion source is confirmed. The board representative let out a breath of relief. So the academy isn't under threat anymore? Not from this attack, the colonel said. The room relaxed slightly, but the tension between the principal and the student still lingered. Dr. Voss looked again at the suspension envelope sitting on the desk. Without speaking, she reached forward and picked it up. The document had seemed so decisive earlier that afternoon, a symbol of authority. Now it looked like evidence of a mistake. She tore it cleanly down the middle. The sound of ripping paper echoed softly across the lab. The girl watched silently as the principal folded the torn pieces and placed them in the trash bin beside the desk. "Your suspension is rescinded," Dr. Voss said. The secretary smiled faintly. That might be the fastest reversal of a disciplinary action in academy history. The board representative chuckled nervously. "I would hope so," but the girl didn't celebrate. She simply nodded once. "Okay." The simplicity of her response surprised the principal again. "You're not upset?" Dr. Voss asked. The girl tilted her head slightly. "About the suspension?" "Yes." She considered the question for a moment. "Not really." The board representative blinked. "You just stopped a cyber attack and got suspended for it." The girl gave a small shrug. "It worked out." The principal studied her carefully. Most students would have demanded recognition by now, or an explanation, or at least an acknowledgement of how unfair the situation had been. But the quiet orphan simply stood there as if the entire event had been another technical problem to solve. Colonel Vale spoke again from the phone. "Mara?" "Yes? I'd like to personally thank you on behalf of the Cyber Defense Division." The girl shifted slightly. "You're welcome. You demonstrated exceptional skill today," the colonel continued. "The relay trap you constructed accelerated our investigation by several hours." She nodded politely. "Glad it helped." The board representative leaned toward the principal. "I think the academy should formally recognize what she did," he whispered. Dr. Voss agreed. The school's reputation depended on acknowledging excellence, and today excellence had appeared in a form no one expected. "Mara," the principal said, "I'd like to invite you to speak with the academy board tomorrow." The girl raised an eyebrow slightly. "About what?" "About how we support students with talents like yours." She glanced briefly around the robotics lab. Machines half finished, tools scattered across the worktables. Leo's small robot still sitting quietly in the corner. "You could start by fixing the network security," she said calmly. The secretary laughed softly. "That might be the most practical suggestion we've heard today." The principal smiled faintly. "Yes, I suspect it is." On the phone, Colonel Vale added one more thought. "And Dr. Voss." "Yes, Colonel? You may want to consider that sometimes the people protecting your institution," he paused briefly, "are the ones you least expect?" The principal looked again at the student standing beside the terminal. For the first time that afternoon she saw her clearly, not as an orphan, not as a disciplinary problem, but as someone who had quietly protected an entire institution while everyone else misunderstood what she was doing. And suddenly the academy's definition of talent felt far too narrow. The realization lingered in the robotics lab long after the last line of hostile code had disappeared from the network. For a moment the room felt almost ordinary again. Machines hummed softly. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall lab windows. Students laughed somewhere down the hallway, unaware that a cyber attack targeting federal infrastructure had just been stopped inside their school. The girl picked up her backpack from the floor and slung it over one shoulder. "Is there anything else you need?" she asked. The question surprised everyone again. After everything that had happened, she still sounded like a student asking if class was over. Dr. Helena Voss stepped forward. "Mara, wait a moment." The girl paused. "Yes?" The principal folded her hands slowly, choosing her words carefully. For years I believed I understood how to recognize exceptional students, she said. Her voice carried less authority now and more honesty. Today proved I still have things to learn. The girl watched her quietly. Across the room, the secretary leaned against a desk, arms crossed, observing the moment with interest. The board representative cleared his throat softly. I think what the principal is trying to say, he added, is that this academy would be proud to have you here. The girl tilted her head slightly. I'm already here. The secretary laughed under her breath. Well, that's technically correct, but the principal shook her head gently. What I mean is that we haven't supported you properly. She gestured around the robotics lab. This room is where students with technical interests come to experiment. The girl glanced at the worktables. Leo likes it. Dr. Voss smiled faintly. Yes, he does. The small robot Leo had been building still sat quietly on the table, wires poking from its metal frame. The girl walked over and adjusted one of the loose connections. The machine's indicator light flickered on. Behind her, the principal continued speaking. When you arrived at Jefferson Crest Academy, Dr. Voss said, we focused on the fact that you were a scholarship student. The girl kept her eyes on the robot. I noticed. The honesty made the principal wince slightly. That shouldn't have defined how we saw you. The board representative nodded. Talent isn't limited to students with wealthy families. The secretary added quietly, sometimes it hides in the quietest corners. The girl straightened and stepped away from the robot. It's fine, she said. You didn't know. Dr. Voss studied her carefully. That calm acceptance was somehow more humbling than anger would have been. I should have known, the principal replied. The student didn't argue. Instead, she walked back toward the computer terminal and glanced once more at the now peaceful network display. Your system still has weaknesses, she said. The secretary smiled. I had a feeling you'd say that. The board representative chuckled. Well, she's not wrong. Dr. Voss crossed her arms thoughtfully. Mara, if you were designing the Academy's security from the beginning, what would you change? The girl considered the question for a moment. Separate the robotics lab network from the administrative servers. The secretary blinked. That's it? That's the biggest vulnerability, the girl explained. It's how the attackers entered the relay. The principal nodded slowly. We'll start there. On the desk, the speakerphone crackled again. Colonel Adrian Vale had remained quietly connected throughout the conversation. Dr. Voss, he said. Yes, Colonel? Our investigation teams will arrive tomorrow morning, the principal nodded. We'll cooperate fully. The colonel paused briefly. And Mara, I hope you understand how unusual your performance today was. The girl shrugged slightly. I just followed the pattern. One of the Pentagon analysts could be heard laughing faintly in the background. Vale returned to the call. You say that like it was obvious. It was. The colonel sounded amused now. Well, obvious or not, your actions prevented a serious breach. She nodded politely. Good. The call ended a moment later. The room fell quiet again. Dr. Voss looked around the robotics lab, the scattered tools, half-built machines, and the quiet student standing near the terminal. A place meant for experiments had suddenly become the center of something far larger. You know, the principal said slowly, Jefferson Crest Academy prides itself on preparing students for the future. The girl waited patiently. But today, Dr. Voss continued, the future walked into my office wearing a backpack and carrying a suspension notice. The secretary smiled and stopped a cyber attack before lunch. The board representative nodded approvingly. I'd say that deserves more than an apology, Dr. Voss agreed. Mara, tomorrow morning we'll be holding a faculty briefing about today's events. The girl raised an eyebrow. You want me there? Yes. Why? The principal smiled faintly. Because sometimes the best way to teach an institution humility, she gestured toward the robotics lab computer, is to let the person who saved it explain how. The robotics lab fell quiet after the principal said it. The girl looked at her for a moment, then glanced around the room again, the wires scattered across worktables, the half-built machines, the terminal that had just turned into a battlefield. To her, it still felt like a normal afternoon, just a problem that needed solving. Across the room, the secretary checked the network monitor one more time. The screen showed calm system traffic moving smoothly across the Academy servers. No alarms, no hostile signals, just silence. Looks stable, she said softly. The board representative exhaled slowly. I don't think anyone in this building will forget today. Dr. Helena Voss nodded. No, I don't think they will. She turned back to the student. Mara, tomorrow the faculty and board will want to hear exactly what happened. The girl adjusted the strap of her backpack. You mean the cyber attack? Yes, and how you stopped it. The girl thought about that for a moment. I can explain the relay structure, she said. That would help, the principal replied. The secretary laughed quietly. I'd just like to understand half the words you used today. The girl allowed the smallest hint of a smile. Okay. For a moment, the room felt lighter. The tension that had filled the lab earlier was gone, replaced by something quieter, respect. Dr. Voss walked toward the window overlooking the courtyard. Students were still leaving campus, chatting with friends, climbing into expensive cars, or heading toward the city bus stop. Most of them would never know how close the academy had come to being used as the center of a federal cyber attack, and they would never know the quiet student who stopped it had almost been sent home in disgrace. The principal turned back toward her. You know, she said thoughtfully, when I signed that suspension form earlier, I believed I was protecting this institution. The girl listened quietly. But today you protected it far better than I did. The words carried no defensiveness now, just honesty. The board representative nodded. That's the kind of lesson schools rarely get. The secretary folded her arms. Especially elite ones, the girl didn't seem particularly interested in recognition. Her attention had drifted back to the small robot Leo Mercer had been building earlier. She reached over and pressed a button on the device. The little machine whirred softly and rolled a few inches across the table. He forgot to connect the motor driver, she said. The principal smiled faintly. You fixed it, it was obvious. Across the room, the secretary chuckled. You keep saying that. The board representative leaned back in his chair. Well, after today, I think we'll start trusting your definition of obvious. The girl picked up the robot and placed it carefully back on the table. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to dim toward evening. A quiet calm had settled across the academy again. But the events of the day had changed something inside those walls. Dr. Voss knew it. Because the next time she saw a quiet student sitting in the back of a classroom, she would wonder what brilliance might be hiding there. Mara, she said gently. Yes? You're free to go home. The girl nodded. Okay. She started toward the door. Halfway there, she paused and glanced back. The network logs are saved on the terminal, she said. The secretary nodded. I'll send them to the Pentagon team. Good. Then the girl stepped into the hallway, disappearing into the quiet corridors of Jefferson Crest Academy, the same halls where, only an hour earlier, she had been walking out with a suspension letter. Now she walked away with something far more powerful: respect. Back inside the robotics lab, the principal stood silently for a moment. Then she said quietly, "Sometimes the people institutions overlook. The board representative finished the thought. Are the ones protecting them? The secretary nodded. And today a single orphan girl proved it. The lab lights dimmed slightly as evening settled over the academy, and somewhere down the hallway the quiet student who stopped a cyber attack walked toward the front gates, just another figure with a backpack leaving school. Except now, the entire institution knew exactly who she was. Ask me for the next story title. Subscribe and don't miss our next story, CEO Fired the Janitor until the hospital called him chief surgeon. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?
Hey! Step back, sir! You're making it worse!
I said get him out of here. He's just the janitor. Mom, I can't breathe. Make it stop. The lobby felt too bright, too loud, every polished surface reflecting panic as security tightened their circle and authority failed in real time. Then, the man in the work uniform crouched anyway and lifted a balloon to his lips, calm as if none of them were watching. No one in that room understood yet that this small, ignored moment was about to upend power itself. This story isn't about balloons or titles. It's about who shows up when fear takes over. Before I show you the exact moment when control slips from the highest floor to the lowest one, by the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. The janitor didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or explain himself. He just stayed where he was, steady, grounded, letting the air fill the thin rubber with slow, even breaths while the girls' sobs hitched and echoed. Around them, shoes shifted, radios crackled, and impatience sharpened into something close to panic. Above it all, behind glass and steel, someone powerful was watching, convinced this was spiraling toward disaster. He'd been scrubbing a spill near the service corridor when the noise started. High, fractured, the kind of sound that set every nerve on edge. He recognized it instantly, the way a parent recognizes a cry in a crowded room. His cart was still there, mop dripping, when he moved. No permission, no announcement, just instinct. Evan Calder was used to being invisible in places like this. Night shifts had taught him how to exist between footsteps, how to pass through gleaming halls without leaving a mark. People saw the uniform, the cart, the bowed head. They didn't see the way his eyes tracked exits or how his shoulders stayed loose, ready. They didn't hear the counting under his breath as he knelt, matching the rhythm of his breathing, to the girl's gasps. Security tried again. "Sir, you need to—" He shook his head once, gentle but final, and kept working the balloon, twisting it slowly. The squeak cut through the noise, something simple and strange enough to interrupt the spiral. The girl's eyes flicked to it despite herself. Her hands clenched, then loosened. Evan felt the familiar pull in his chest, the memory of another small body shaking against him years ago, another voice breaking on fear. His son's. Noah had been 6 then, terrified of hospitals after everything they'd lost. Evan had learned the hard way how fragile calm could be and how powerful. "Look," he murmured, voice low, meant only for her. "It's okay, watch this." He didn't rush. He never rushed. The balloon became a crooked dog, then something else entirely, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that her breathing slowed enough to follow his hand. Inhale, exhale. Again. Around them, impatience softened into confusion. Phones lowered. Someone whispered. From the upper level, a woman pressed her hand to the glass, her reflection fractured across the city beyond. This wasn't how crises were supposed to be handled. There were protocols, experts, money. Evan felt the shift before he saw it, the room settling, the girl's shoulders dropping an inch. Relief crept in, cautious, almost afraid to believe itself. He stayed where he was, grounded, knowing the moment wasn't over yet. It never ended all at once. Inside, something steadied too. He wasn't thinking about his past or the life he'd stepped away from. He was thinking about getting home before dawn, about Noah's lunch packed crooked this morning, about how some things, fear, love, responsibility, ignored titles completely. The balloon slipped from his fingers and rolled across the marble floor. No one stopped it. For the first time since the panic began, the room let out a breath together. And in that quiet, the janitor remained, kneeling, exactly where power never thought to look. The quiet didn't last long. It never did in places built on momentum and money. As the girl was guided gently into her mother's arms, the space filled again with motion. Security radios murmuring, staff whispering, the polished machine restarting itself. Evan stayed kneeling a second longer, making sure her breathing held, then slowly stood. His knees complained. Marble always did that. Someone cleared their throat behind him. He didn't turn right away. He'd learned not to react too fast when attention finally landed. It usually meant trouble. "Sir," the security lead said, voice tight but no longer sharp, "we're going to need a statement." He nodded once. "Sure." Around them, people watched with a different kind of interest now, not suspicion exactly, something closer to recalibration. He felt it in the way eyes lingered on his hands, still holding a deflated balloon, on the janitor's cart abandoned nearby, like evidence of a life paused mid-task. From the upper floor, Mara Whitcomb lowered her hand from the glass. Her daughter clung to her, small fingers twisted into silk, breath still uneven but no longer breaking. The expert she'd summoned stood uselessly behind her, tablets dim, credentials suddenly irrelevant. She kept her gaze on the man below, trying to reconcile the calm she'd witnessed with the role he occupied. Evan pushed his cart toward the service corridor when no one stopped him. The wheels squeaked, familiar, grounding. He liked that sound. It meant forward motion. He liked routines for the same reason. They held things together. The corridor swallowed him in cooler air and harsher light. The building sounded different here, pipes ticking, vents humming, the low thrum of systems that never slept. He took a breath, longer than necessary, and felt the adrenaline fade. Only then did his hands start to shake. He leaned the mop against the wall and flexed his fingers. He hated that part, the after. The body remembering even when the mind had stayed steady. He closed his eyes briefly and pictured Noah's face this morning. Cereal bowl half finished, shoes mismatched again. He'd laughed then, kissed his son's hair, promised he'd be home before sunrise. He always made that promise. Footsteps echoed, not rushed, intentional. You didn't have to do that. He opened his eyes. Mara stood a few feet away, posture perfect despite the strain around her mouth, no entourage, no glass between them now. He shrugged lightly. Kid needed help. That situation could have escalated, she said. You put yourself at risk. He met her gaze, not challenging, not deferential either, just honest. She was already at risk. Silence stretched. Somewhere, a machine clicked on. She studied him, really looked, and something in her expression shifted. Less certainty, more curiosity. "What's your name?" she asked. He gave her his first name, only. It felt like enough. She nodded. "Thank you for what you did." He accepted the words the way he'd learned to accept apologies, without grasping, without resentment. She did most of the work. A faint, confused smile flickered across her face. It vanished as quickly as it came. "If there's anything, I'm good," he said gently, Just doing my job. Her eyes dropped to the cart and the uniform, the scuffed boots. When she looked back up, the distance between worlds felt thinner, more fragile. She left then, pulled back into her orbit of power and urgency. Evan returned to his cart. There was still a spill to clean, always was. As he worked, a few employees passed by. One murmured thanks. Another offered a nod that held more respect than he was used to. It didn't change his pace. Validation was nice, but it didn't pay rent or pack lunches. Still, something had shifted. He felt it like a draft through a closed door. When his shift ended, he clocked out and stepped into the early morning chill. The city was quieter, softer around the edges. He pulled out his phone, thumb hovering, then typed a quick message home. On the train, exhaustion settled in deep. He closed his eyes, unaware of the conversations already unfolding upstairs, of how his calm had disrupted assumptions that would not easily reform. If you're still with this story, subscribe now. You won't want to miss how this moment keeps unfolding. The train rocked gently, carrying him back toward the life he'd built piece by piece, unaware that the building he'd just cleaned was already learning his name. The train slowed with a familiar groan, metal on metal, and he opened his eyes just long enough to see his stop slide past the fogged window. Morning light crept in low and pale, touching faces that looked as tired as he felt. He stood, steadying himself on the pole, and stepped onto the platform with the rest of the quiet crowd. Home smelled like coffee and laundry detergent. Noah was still asleep on the couch, blanket kicked off, cartoon paused mid-frame. Evan set his bag down without a sound and draped the blanket back over his son's shoulders. The kid stirred, mumbled something unintelligible, then settled again. That was enough. He moved to the kitchen, rinsed his mug, and leaned against the counter, letting the silence do its work. His phone buzzed once. Then again. He frowned. No one texted him this early unless something was wrong. A message preview flashed across the screen from a number he didn't recognize. "Is this Evan? This is Lila's aide." He didn't open it. Not yet. He set the phone face down and stared out the small window above the sink, watching the city wake up. He'd learned the hard way that some doors, once cracked open, never quite closed again. By the time he woke Noah for school, the phone had buzzed 3 more times. He ignored them all. Breakfast happened. Shoes were found. A permission slip was signed, with a pen that barely worked. At the door, Noah hugged him hard, arms tight around his waist. "You okay?" his son asked, looking up with that too-old seriousness kids carried when they'd seen loss early. "Yeah," he said, meaning it. "Just tired." After the door closed behind Noah, Evan finally picked up the phone. He read the messages slowly. No demands, no threats, just thanks, questions, a request to talk when convenient. The words were careful, respectful. That almost made it worse. He typed a brief response. "I'm glad she's okay. I'm at work nights, hard to talk much." 3 dots appeared almost immediately, then stopped, then appeared again. Finally, "Understood. If you're willing, Ms. Whitcomb would like to speak with you. No pressure." He exhaled and slipped the phone into his pocket. Pressure didn't